So thank you all for coming. This is a really delight to be here and see how many people have showed up. But I have to say, I have a surprise for you right off the bat. I've changed the title of the talk. But don't fret, don't worry. It's as I was going through preparing this, I realized that this is more applicable than to parents who have kids who have questions. This is generally applicable in the entire Christian realm. And so the revised talk is Modern Scientific and Philosophical Challenges to Faith, What They Are, and Why You Should Care. Okay. So here's the outline. We're going to talk about, can everybody see this, by the way? Is this too low? You can see over the devices here? Raise your hand if you can't see. Okay, everybody sees. Okay, so I'll start with why you should care. Why should you care that there's philosophical challenges to your beliefs, right? I mean, there might be, but why does it matter? I'll talk about what those scientific and philosophical challenges are, and then we'll have some closing thoughts, and I'll tell you what I've been thinking about these things. All right, so why should you care that there are challenges to your faith? This is going to be a highly controversial part of the talk, and I hope to have discussion with people. But there are two worldviews that are at loggerheads in our that's okay, in our society. It's getting cut off at the bottom there, but if you miss anything incredibly important, I'll be sure to dictate it to you. Okay, so I have two quotes here. The top one is from Sister Vasa. Is everybody familiar with her? She's a household name where we are. I love her very dearly. And this was in her daily reflections from January 14th, 2020. And I'll read it to you now. This beautiful central prayer of our divine liturgy reminds me of the many things we do not know, not only about God, ineffable, inconceivable, invisible, incomprehensible, but also about his creation. In our technologically savvy information age, we might tend to approach the created world, including ourselves and our lives, more as a puzzle to be figured out and fixed than as a mystery to be accepted. But our tradition removes a lot of that pressure from us to figure out or fix every ambiguity that confronts us and invites us to accept it in awe, faith, and gratitude. Okay. I want you to draw your attention to what she is really saying. She is directing this comment towards his creation. This isn't toward theology. This is toward the created world. This means if there are ambiguities that you cannot resolve, put the blinders on and keep walking and don't worry about it. Now let's look at this other opinion by a man named Richard Dawkins, and he said this in the God Delusion debate. He is a professor at Oxford University, England, and he is a very widely read public intellectual, maybe one of the most widely read atheists in our time. And I will try to do justice to his quote. But religion teaches us to be satisfied with not really understanding. Every one of these difficult questions that comes up, science says, right, let's roll up our sleeves and work on it. Religion says, oh, God did it. We don't need to work on it. God did it. It's as simple as that. These are very, very contentious positions. Now, if you're a young person who's going to school, going to college and high school, and you are a believer, and someone mentions to you, well, you believe in God, eh? Well, what about evolution? I mean, come on, really? Don't you? I mean, you religious folks, you just put your blinders on. You don't even acknowledge that there's scientific proof that God doesn't exist. What's wrong with you? Do you check your brain at the door? This is what we are living in. This is what our children are growing up in. This type of contentious atmosphere in the United States of America. Okay, some more contemporary voices right now. The professor and the president, I've called this. professor of philosophy of biology at Duke University, which is a very prestigious school. Dr. Alex Rosenberg says, the physical and biological sciences make the existence of God less probable than the existence of Santa Claus. Okay, this is a prominent professor. He is teaching and educating future teachers as well as students right now. Now here's a quote from President Barack Obama, public speech June 28, 2006. Which passages of Scripture should guide our public policy? Should we go with Leviticus, which suggests slavery is okay and that eating shellfish is an abomination? Or could we go with Deuteronomy, which suggests stoning your child if he strays from the faith? Or should we just stick with the Sermon on the Mount, a passage that is so radical that it's doubtful our own Defense Department would survive its application? It doesn't take too much to read between the lines. What he's saying is that how could you possibly believe that book, that Bible, is divinely inspired? It's absurd. That's exactly what he's saying. These are the opinion makers. These are the people who are in the upper echelon, the elites of society, and what they say publicly and believe trickles down through the educational system and into the society at large. So, what was the importance of religion in the past in this country? Well, the Declaration of Independence, in my mind, and I think quite arguably correct, the greatest, most far-reaching political document ever devised by human beings. What does it say? It says, we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. What about John Adams, second President of the United States, one of the founders of this country? Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Quite a statement. Contrast that with the modern statement of President Obama. Okay, so we've seen that there are these competing, contended views in the world today, in the United States. So why does it matter? Okay, there's contentious views, so why does it matter? Well, it matters because as more and more people leave religion, there is going to be less and less tolerance for religious norms of moral behavior. And I know we've already experienced this with the destruction of traditional marriage, with the LGBTQ movement, and now it's pushing into the realm of parental authority. So I would like to read to you an article from this month from the Federalist. It says, last Friday, and this is speaking of January 14th, the highest court in British, by the way, it says out of Canada, which is not across the Atlantic. This is just our neighbors to the north, and what's happening there is not going to be long before it happens here. Last Friday, the highest court in British Columbia, Canada, ruled that a father could not prevent doctors from giving his 15-year-old daughter testosterone injections to affirm her transgender male identity. The court also ruled that the father, Clark, must acknowledge and refer to his daughter, Maxine, as a male and refrain from talking to the media about her case. So this father has a poor daughter who thinks she should be a man, and the doctors in that country, Canada, have told him, no, sir, if you think that she should wait a little while longer until she's more mature to make a decision like this, we don't need your consent. We doctors know better, and we are going to go ahead with the treatment. So parental authority is now being undermined with the pushing of religion out of the public square. As of January 2020, states that have banned psychological counseling for teens that question their gender is shown in blue. And by all signs, it's only going to increase. So if I haven't convinced you why you should care yet, then I still have some more stuff coming. So people do not reject religion for no reason. People leave their faith, they stay away from faith precisely because they have reasons, because they have heard somebody say something, they've heard conversations. This has been very, very well documented by Nathan Jacobs in his documentary, Becoming Truly Human, which I would like to play a clip for you now.
The third talk. So, with that, let's meet the nuns. Can we get the, let's do the second from the bottom, BTH original teaser. So you get to actually see one of the potential trailers that didn't go live on the internet, so. How many folks here have some kind of a religious upbringing? Okay, all of you.
Pretty much everybody in my family is very deeply religious.
We used to go to Catholic church all the time when I was younger.
When I was young, we were Baptist.
When I was in, probably the middle school age, I was super much, Christian, I believe in God.
About 3 years ago, I would have identified as a Christian.
I had a teacher actually tell me all the stuff in the Bible wasn't real.
In my mind, it was imperative that the doubt was killed completely.
It kind of just made me start thinking about all other things that goes along with having faith in somebody that you can't really talk to or see.
My big one was the question of suffering. Why is there suffering in the world?
Questioning isn't something that's welcomed in the Christian community.
In that framework, growing up, questions were threats.
I was terrified. Terrified. It was really hard to give up the concept of God as I understood it.
When I say I'm not a Christian anymore, it doesn't mean that I'm not spiritual.
I believe in karma, fate, things happen for a reason.
I just believe in being a good person.
When you come to rescue me,
My name is Kristen.
I am Tyler.
My name is Laura.
My name is Joshua.
My name's Tiffany.
My name is Emily.
My name is Eric, and no, I do not have a religious affiliation.
when I say that I'm fine.
Okay. So there you have it. Flesh and Blood Nuns.
Okay, so that was really informative. So I'd like to point out a couple things about that clip. Did you notice that every single one of them came from a religious household? Every single one. And virtually all of them left because they had questions and nobody had answers. If that doesn't strike us as something is wrong with what we are doing today, this is a problem, then I don't know what will. Okay, so here are some statistics that he used in his talk. I'd like to point out that 22% of the people who identify as nuns cite that one reason is they just have a lack of a belief in God, and about the same amount say that there's some religious teaching that they disagree with. It does get a little foggy because one religious teaching is that God exists, so there's some overlap there. So I think it's potentially more than 22% that actually lack a belief in God. But there's some other modern Christian perspectives that I'd like you to be aware of, and I think there's some good things to say here. So Os Guinness is out of Oxford, and my friend Jacob, who's here, has pointed me to this book, and a quote. It says from the book, "Fit Bodies and Fat Minds. As modern society grows increasingly secular in some spheres of life and pluralistic in others, powerful alternatives to the gospel are proliferating. Similarly, as modern life calls into question more and more of what it means to be fundamentally humans, including such requirements as personal identity, truth, and stable families, today society's questions and crises mount year by year." And he's absolutely right. He is absolutely right that the world in which we live, the country in which we live, there are questions that challenge faith, and it is a crisis. That society is coming apart at the seams, quite frankly, because we're not fighting. That's why. Because religious people are being pushed out, and we're not educating ourselves to be able to answer the challenges of the day. So here's a quote from Richard Swinburne. He's an Orthodox professor of philosophy at Oxford. In the book Turning East, "There is no point in confessing your sins to God or worshiping him if he almost certainly doesn't exist. If there are reasonable arguments that suggest that he almost certainly doesn't exist, they need to be treated seriously and shown to be unsound. To ignore them is insulting to God." And I think he's right. I think God has given us the powers of reason, and to not use them in a way to help society come back to him is really bad on our part. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that this matters, that the challenges out there matter to each and every one of our lives and the lives of the people we love. Okay. I've been thinking about this for a while, and I think it all boils down to this: the undermining of Genesis 1:27. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created him. He created them. Virtually every modern objection that I am aware of is attacking that verse in some way, shape, or form. Especially, it is moving at light speed in this country. As soon as there was the redefinition of marriage, now he didn't create the male and female, came 2 years later. 2 years later, it's not going to stop. This idea that human beings are more than just moving parts and blood and soil is under attack. And that it boils down to that, and that is it. Okay, well, here's some good news. There are no scientific objections to God's existence. There aren't. There are scientists who don't like the idea of God, but there's no scientific fact that challenges God's existence. Knowing the mass of an electron doesn't do anything to challenge God's existence. Knowing the human genome doesn't. Knowing the diameter of the Milky Way galaxy, that doesn't do anything to challenge God's existence. But you know what? Some scientists just don't like the idea of God, and they use these facts in philosophical arguments to challenge God's existence. All right, so how did this happen? How did scientists become so, I want to say, aggressive toward the religious worldview? Well, the scientific revolution began, it's debatable when it began, but you can pretty much start with Copernicus. He was the first person to put forth the idea that the solar system was centered on the sun and not the earth, and that the planets revolve around the earth. And then everybody knows Galileo and his disagreements with Rome, and they did a lot. But the scientific project of being able to describe in mechanistic terms and with as much mathematical precision as possible really had its culmination in the works of Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton formulated a theory of gravity that he could use to explain how the planets moved. He formulated his laws of motion, conservation of momentum. He could now figure out how planets moved, how cannonballs moved, and virtually everything else in the universe. He could just figure out how it moved. Okay, so science at that point in time is really moving forward fast. People are learning things. Daniel Bernoulli did work on fluid mechanics. He figured out how lift works in wings. So how do you get an airplane to fly? Bernoulli figures it out. How does pressure lift things into the air? Carl Friedrich Gauss, arguably the greatest mathematician scientist who ever lived. His contributions cannot be understated. The man did major contributions in electricity, magnetism, gravitation, optics, non-Euclidean geometry. He laid the foundation for what would later become Einstein's general theory of relativity. The man was a perfectionist. He only published things he thought were absolutely flawless. His colleagues said, had he actually published everything that he did, he would have advanced the world of mathematics by 50 years. He was an intellect, he was a giant among giants. And I have this quote here, "The world would be nonsense, the whole creation in absurdity without immortality." He was a religious man. And, I am a physicist of sorts myself, and then I don't want to talk bad about the descriptive sciences, but the main challenges of today come from the descriptive sciences. How can it be that a man like Richard Dawkins, a biologist, can have such certitude that God doesn't exist when people like Galileo, Newton, Gauss took it as obvious that there was a creator? How could that be? Well, the inanimate world was very well characterized by physics and mathematics, but the biological world resisted such a description. It posed a serious problem for the 19th century scientific secularizing mechanistic project. See, biological structures seem to have a purposiveness that the inanimate world just doesn't have. So there are different types of questions. If you ask the question, what's the purpose of Mercury whipping around the sun at such a high rate, that doesn't really make, what's the purpose of that? Doesn't make much sense. But if you ask the purpose, what is the purpose of a cat's sharp claws, and why are they retractable, and a dog's claws are not, that's a different type of question. Now, a cat's claws, you could say, they're sharp and retractable because of the way a cat hunts its prey. It sneaks up behind him, jumps on him. He needs those sharp claws to, dig in and then have a suitable frolic from his point of view before he has his dinner. And dogs, they hunt in packs. They have jaws, and they don't need sharp claws. They run, and they team up together, and they take their dinner down that way. And they don't have sharp claws because they don't need sharp claws. There's a reason for it. Okay, well, enter Charles Darwin. I'll tell you a bit about the man. He was born in 1809 and lived until 1882. He was from a prominent family, very wealthy. His mother was a Wedgwood of Wedgwood, China. We still have that with us today. And his grandfather is Josiah Wedgwood, very wealthy. And so he grew up with a good education. Eventually, he went to Cambridge. They thought he was going to be a clergyman, but he was a fairly mediocre student. He spent his time out in the fields collecting specimens, and he liked the biological thing a lot more. And eventually, when he was there, a man named J.S. Henslow was looking around to see who might be a suitable biologist to take on a trip around the world, and someone recommended Darwin to be the biologist on the HMS Beagle. And his father was absolutely opposed. He said, "No, you haven't worked hard enough. There's no way you're going to have all that fun." And then his grandfather, Josiah, who is fairly wealthy, kind of said, "I think you should go." And Darwin's father acquiesced, and hence Darwin was on the boat. So 1831, he set sail on the Beagle. This is right here, the HMS Beagle. And this is where he had his decisive vision. On the Galapagos Islands, he noticed these finches. Everyone's heard. Today they're actually called Darwin's finches. He noticed that their beaks were adapted to where they were getting their food. And that sparked the idea in his mind, aha, there is some kind of evolution going on here. And that was really the decisive moment for him. And he began writing things down and collecting specimens, and he arrived home after sailing around the world in 1836. And his ideas, he thought they would stir controversy. So he sat on it and worked on it for 20 years. He didn't publish anything until a man named Alfred Russel Wallace published his own version of evolution by natural selection in 1859, and that gave Dawkins, Darwin, a little boost, and he said, okay, I got to put something together really quick. I've got all this data. I'm going to publish a much smaller work, and that's what was to become On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Okay, so here it is. What is Darwin's account of the biological order, the purposiveness in the world in purely mechanistic terms? Here's his evolution. He's got it hinges on three ideas. The first is random variation within species. So look at dogs, Labradors or something. Each one is a little bit different from the other. They're not all the same. Some are faster, some are smarter, some have this, some have that. Okay, so that's the first key. He needed random variation within the species. Second key is natural selection. See, he was familiar with breeding of dogs. Yeah, of course, yeah, we can see this dog has that trait and this other dog has a different trait. We want to bring those together and have both those traits, or the sheep, we want the good wool. And breeders over time would choose, they would be the selection process. The human, the mind, would select the particular characteristics and get what they wanted. But Darwin said, no, we need something that's unguided, something that doesn't have a mind. It's just nature. And he found the answer to that in a work by a man of the name Thomas Malthus, who published a paper called On Population and what was his? An essay on the principle of population. And effectively what he showed was that populations increase geometrically, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, whereas food resources only increase arithmetically, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So in other words, there's never enough to go around in the natural world. So that exerts a pressure. So because of the scarcity of food, only the more fit animals will survive. That's the natural selection process in Darwin's mind. And his third problem was that, well, how do you go from a dinosaur to a chicken and in a reasonable amount of time through this process? Well, he needed something called deep time. He needed the Earth to be billions of years old for this to happen. And he found the answer to that in a geology book that he had read while he was on the Beagle. So there were his three pillars of his theory, and it all culminates, and here's the big punchline that is relevant today. Natural selection acting on random variations over deep time gives rise to all biological life. In other words, you are created by chance. You are created as a random variation that has simply made it as far as you did because you were able to get through the pressure of scarcity. Quickly, this is just an aside. It's actually now being argued quite persuasively that Darwin actually took an idea from Adam Smith and applied it to the biological world. So, you know, market economics. So maybe you've heard this, that 95% of all businesses that start fail. We only see the businesses that survive. Adam Smith called this, in 1776 actually, he published The Wealth of Nations, and he called this the invisible hand. The idea that there's all kinds of businesses starting up all over the place, but only the ones that can adapt to consumer need are the ones that survive. And that sounds an awful lot like evolution, doesn't it? It sounds a lot like variation and unguided selection. And just an interesting note that many people, and in fact Darwin himself, used economic language On the Origin of Species. And just an interesting note that perhaps he took some of those ideas from the theory of market economics. Okay, so there it is. There it is, the main bludgeon that Richard Dawkins and probably most biology professors that your kids are ever going to encounter are going to use to enlighten you, to help you understand that you are a product of the natural world, and that your religious beliefs, you can keep them to yourself. American Express, don't leave home without it. Well, with your religion, make sure you do leave home without it, because in the public sphere, it's not accepted intellectually. Okay, so that's his bludgeon. Now, but there are some conceptual problems with this that I think you should be aware of. One is that there's this problem of intermediate adaptations. Each stage of the transformation has to work. To be beneficial, a half wing doesn't do anything for you. Neither does half an eye or any other complex part. So that is a major problem for this theory that people just kind of gloss over. But what even bigger one is speech. How can you, I can't personally imagine, if you were the first person that had the random variation that gave you the ability to process speech, how would that be a benefit, because there would be nobody else to talk to? So this seems to be a problem. In the anthropological record, there's also a problem that tools and art seem to have appeared very abruptly in the record. About 50,000 years ago, we went from stone axes to fish hooks and javelins and artwork and speech, and all this stuff seems to not have happened gradually, but happened very abruptly, which would contravene the natural selection hypothesis. And these last two are very charged. Under Darwin's model, objective moral values and duties should not exist. In a selfish world, the selfish succeed. And that's the law of nature. And according to Darwin, that's exactly what we should be doing. If we want our genes to survive and move on, then we look out for number one, and that's it. Okay, so we're back to the fast forward from Darwin to 2020, and he still has gone viral, and some fashionable doctrines in the academy. This is their gospel, The Origin of Species. I have a couple of quotes here from Richard Dawkins. The first one is from The Blind Watchmaker. Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Physics is the study of simple things that do not tempt us to invoke design. It's interesting. Physics is the study of simple things that do not tempt us to invoke design. Okay. Next, we are machines built by DNA, whose purpose is to make more copies of the same DNA. This is exactly what we are for. We are machines for propagating DNA, and the propagation of DNA is a self-sustaining process. It is every living object's sole reason for living. Given as the Ultraviolet Garden, of all places, the Royal Institute Christmas Lecture, number 4. Okay. Well, okay, so I'd like to call your attention to the appearance of having been designed for a purpose, but not really. And also, the every living object's sole reason for living. There's your attack on Genesis 1:27. And now, I'd like to introduce you to a man named Eugene Wigner. He's one of the greatest scientists of the 20th century, a physicist. He published a paper and presented it at New York University, the Courant Institute for Mathematical Sciences, in 1959. The title of the paper was The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. In that paper, he argues that there is no reason the natural world should be able to be described by abstract thought. How could it possibly be that concrete matter can behave according to abstract entities that exist only in our minds? He didn't go as far as to say at the end that he postulated because it was designed with intelligence. However, he did say, certainly it is hard to believe that our reasoning power was brought by Darwin's process of natural selection to the perfection which it seems to possess. So, well, Mr. Dawkins, there are people in the mathematical sciences who have questions about your interpretation of natural selection. Okay, so that brings me to this. How do we decide, agency or accident? When you see, take a bike ride around Mackinac Island. How many people have been there? If you bike ride around, you see these little towers, these little rock formations. What do you think? Did it just happen? Or designed? Someone did it. Okay, now I'm going to ask you a harder question. How do you know? How do you know if something is designed or not? It's a tough question. So interestingly, in my family's over here, my son's 11. The other day I asked him, Thomas, come look at this. Tell me, do you see something designed here? He said, yeah, the rock stack. I said, okay, excellent. How do you know? He's like, what do you mean, how do you know? Because someone built it. I said, no, really, stop, think about it, go back, go away, think, come back, and tell me what you uncover. So time goes by, a day or so. I catch him in the kitchen and I say, okay, Thomas, you think about that question I asked you? He said, yes. He said, yes, Dad, I did. I said, okay, so what's your answer? He said, well, it's hard to balance rocks. And I thought that was an excellent insight. What he's saying is that the laws of physics do not give rise to structure. They don't. Intelligence has to put it on top. It has to look, analyze, see, boom, boom, boom. Because nature is on itself, it just doesn't happen. Wherever you look in nature, do you see structures like this? No. It has intelligence behind it. Here's an example. On this side, you're looking out down the axis of the beta DNA double helix, the DNA molecule. On the right is the rose window in England, York Minster. You clearly know that the one on the left was designed by intelligence. The one on the right, in my mind, screams intelligence as well. I don't see how chaotic forces of nature could produce something with such geometric structure. Okay, the information revolution. So the discovery of DNA in 1953 by James Watson and Francis Crick. That's the DNA molecule. And you'll notice there's these lines here. They're base pairs. There's only 4 different chemicals that are inside this molecule that's shaped like a double helix. And what we've come to find out, James Crick hypothesized that, yeah, there's 4 chemicals, but what really matters is the sequence in which they are arranged. They are arranged as an instruction set for building proteins. So that's interesting because now we know that the random variation that Darwin was seeking actually occurs at the level of the DNA. So here's the question. If you take an English sentence, just take any sentence you want, and you randomly permute or delete letters, does the sentence still carry information? Well, it carries less, that's for sure. It can obscure the meaning, but Darwin and Richard Dawkins would have you believe that by randomly deleting or inserting information, you can have major innovations in information, major increases. This is so contrary to common sense that it is almost incredulous. Okay, so I'd like to tell you, okay, some more good news. Yes, there's the world out there, the educational institutions, the media, Hollywood, the high political offices, they're all on board with this, but there are some dissenting views. This is an excellent book, Mind and Cosmos. I'll read the subtitle to you now. The title is Mind and Cosmos. The subtitle is Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. And that's written by Thomas Nagel, who himself is an atheist. He says the following: it is prima facie highly implausible that life as we know it is the result of a sequence of physical accidents together with the mechanism of natural selection. So prima facie highly implausible, that means it is so obviously not true that it is almost a violation of human rationality to say so. Now, another man, Douglas Axe, he's an excellent scientist. If you can look him up in any of his talks on YouTube, I highly recommend it. When he was at Cambridge University, his research group showed mathematically that the probability of random variation plus natural selection producing a functional biological form was 1 over 10 to the 77th power. Now, I'd like to put that in perspective for you. There are 10 to the 67th atoms in the Milky Way galaxy. Okay, imagine this. I take all the atoms in the entire galaxy. Just to give, does anybody know how big the galaxy is? It's 100,000 light years in diameter. That means you're traveling at the speed of light for 100,000 years just to get from one end to the other. It's really big. I take all those atoms, I put them in a bag, and I'm going to put a smiley face on one of them. And you get to reach into the bag and pick it out. And if you get the smiley face, you win. You're more likely to get that smiley face than to produce a functional form from random variation and natural selection. More likely. Another way to put it is this. You're familiar with the Mega Millions lottery? There's 5 balls, each one numbered 1 through 70, and an additional ball numbered 1 through 25. The odds of winning that is 1 in 300 million. The odds of winning it 10 consecutive times in a row are better than producing a functional form from random variation and natural selection. Just to give you an idea of how implausible it is to have this happen. Okay, so leaving biology for a moment, there's the second attack on humanity, and that comes from artificial intelligence, AI. A very popular voice in the world today is Daniel Dennett from Tufts University. And he's quoted here from the Financial Times in 2017. I've been arguing for years that, yes, in principle, it's possible for human consciousness to be realized in a machine. After all, that's what we are, says Daniel Dennett. We're robots, made of robots, made of robots. We're incredibly complex, trillions of moving parts, but they're all non-miraculous robotic parts. So that's a philosopher of science from Tufts University, and he's, as you would imagine, friends with Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and the others. And they are educating the future educators and educating all of our kids. Okay, David Galerter, anybody familiar with him? He is one of the pioneers of artificial intelligence. He is a professor of computer science at Yale University. Now, there was a lot of, do you guys remember Deep Blue? You remember Gary Kasparov, the greatest chess player that ever lived? IBM built a supercomputer to play him in chess. And the claim was, this is it. This is it, guys. If the machine can beat Kasparov at chess, it's over. Humans are sunk. We're just nuts and bolts. Computers are going to take over the world. Skynet's going to go live. Ultron's going to come. It's over. Okay. So David Galerter, he had this to say about the match between Gary Kasparov and Deep Blue. I'd like you to listen to what he has to say. The idea that Deep Blue has a mind is absurd. How can an object that wants nothing, fears nothing, enjoys nothing, needs nothing, and cares about nothing have a mind? It wins at chess, yes, but not because it wants to. It isn't happy when it wins or sad when it loses. What are Deep Blue's after-match plans if it beats Kasparov? Is it hoping to take Deep Pink out for a night on the town? No, it doesn't care. It is a machine designed for that purpose. No matter what feats it performs inside, it will always be zeros and ones. In the long run, I doubt there is any human behavior computers cannot fake, any kind of performance they cannot put on. It is conceivable that one day computers will be better than human beings at nearly everything. I can imagine that someday a person might have a computer as their best friend, but that will be sad. Like having a dog as your best friend, but only sadder. The gap between the human and the machine is permanent and will never be closed. Machines will continue to make life easier, healthier, richer, and more puzzling. And human beings will continue to care ultimately about the same things they always have, about one another, and many of them about God. Quite a statement from a pioneer of artificial intelligence. Okay, so closing thoughts. I'd like to read to you a quote from Hank Hanegraaff in his book, Truth Matters, Life Matters More. If truth matters, and it most surely does, the church must take the task of Christian education seriously. Not edutain, but educate. Equip our children and theirs to always be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have. That's pretty, I think he's hitting the nail right on the head. The last couple generations, we have failed. We have bought in to the idea that to educate must be fun. Education must be gripping, yes. Awe-inspiring, yes. It must be loving, but it must be hard work. It must be. There's nothing in this world, Father Michael at Holy Transfiguration says this all the time. Anything in this world worth knowing is worth working hard to know, is worth working hard for. And we have done the experiment over 2 generations of making religious education fun, and we are living the consequences of that today. Oh yeah, secular academics. What do we tell our kids? Go to school, study hard, get A's. What about for religious education? We're happy if they just show up. Well, I tell you, we have a lot of work to do, and I believe that the work we have to do is critical, and it really does matter. So thank you for your attention. I really enjoyed being here. Are there any questions? Are there any? Yeah, Dan.
John, I was just wondering how you maybe discuss evolution with your children. You know, I know it's kind of a broad topic, but
Yeah.
you know, it's something that I know this is going to come up pretty soon for me, and just wanted to pick your brain on it.
Yeah, you know, I haven't. Thomas is the oldest one, and he's 11. Well, he's seen me working on this, and he's come and asked questions, and I really talk to him like I talk to an adult, really. I mean, at 11 years old, I think that they are mature enough to handle talking about random variation, natural selection, using your reason, using your common sense to say, okay, you know, what's going on here? What are the implications of that? I think the more important, or not more important, but an equally important question is, how do you talk to your kids about Genesis? How do you, were Adam and Eve, were they real? What's going on? I mean, Noah, the flood, you know, approaching those topics with a sober mind and a good exegesis is, I think, really, really important. More so than the science, because that's most of the folks that you saw in that Becoming Truly Human clip, I believe their worldviews were destroyed because they were brought up in a very biblical, literalist household, where there was no wiggle room for anything. It was this is how it is, this is dictated truth, and that's just it. Anything that contradicts it is false. So, and I know that there are a lot of educators. Father Michael at HTOC is a resource of biblical exegesis that is truly astounding. I mean, he can explain things from many different points of view. But I think that's, to answer your question, that talking about the science is one thing, but I think understanding the biblical narrative is where I would start. Any other questions? Yes, in the back.
So a lot of emphasis today is put on STEM education.
Yes.
To the detriment of arts and music education. And I think one difference between AI and the human experience is the beauty of arts and music and feeding the soul in that way. As an educator and as someone who is talking about these STEM-related issues, how can you talk about the importance of the human aspect and feeding the soul through these non-STEM topics in public education, especially where it's being defunded, and we're seeing academia from the top down defunding it to the rigor of STEM.
Yes, this is a big problem. You have brought up something that is a really big problem, because education has now become an investment. Because the cost of education is so high, we look at it as, look, there better be return on investment. I mean, how are you going to get a job unless you study computers or some other STEM-related thing? To the detriment, education originally was to feed the soul. It was what is your purpose of your existence? I recall a quote from John Adams in one of his diaries. He was walking at night and he looked up at the stars and he was thrown in this kind of transport, and he said to himself, of all the wonderful provisions that God has given us, all of the provisions, nothing compares to the provisions of reason and intelligence, because He has given us the means to find the truth, to find the true end of our existence. And I think education has really suffered. Like you're saying, the arts, philosophy, theology, beauty, none of it's so now watered down. We have to pursue it on our own, and we have to. One place I can say right now that we could look is, maybe you're familiar with Jonathan Pajot, the iconographer from Canada. He's a great resource to start your art kind of re-education or education for the first time. But your point is well taken, that the arts are really important, and I just don't know, other than pursuing on our own through the internet resources, I just don't know what to say. Yeah, Bob?
Yeah, the Big Bang Theory, from the point of physics, and, is it probable or likely, and how does that tie in with our biblical understanding, if it does?
So the prevailing view for right now is that the Big Bang, the Big Bang is the hypothesis that the universe, all space, time, and matter began at a single instant in the past. And that troubled a lot of astronomers when it first was proposed, and then observations tended to confirm it. That troubled a lot of people because a Big Bang suggests a Big Banger. The universe, things don't pop into existence on their own. I think that the Big Bang Theory lines very, very well with the biblical narrative of, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, there are challenges to the Big Bang Theory that are surfacing. Some people are talking about a multiverse, that there are many, many universes, and we are just one of many, and the odds just happen to turn in our favor that this one was able to support life. Of course, there's no empirical evidence to suggest that that's even remotely possible. And in fact, I don't believe that there's any way that it could, because we can't interact with alternate universes. So it makes for a good Marvel movie, but beyond that, I don't see anything that that would contravene the biblical narrative. Did you have no? Any others? Well, yes, Julia.
I just wanted to comment. I grew up at PCA, Plymouth Christian Academy, and my senior year they were giving us this book that was called Fish Out of Water, and sort of what to expect when you're going to college. You know, you're going to be dealing with all these professors and such, and we were prepared in a way, and taught about creation and such. But it was really interesting, even in the Christian high schools, they're encouraging you to go to college, and I was just like, so I'm going to pay to have someone lie to me, and then pay them to, and then have to regurgitate their lie back to them, and that's called learning, and that's called a grade, good grade, and it's just really interesting, and I just want to voice to parents that college isn't the only way to learn, and there's other ways, and college might not be the right thing to invest in.
That's a point very, very well taken. It's we've come to a point where education is very expensive, and quite frankly, a lot of it is propaganda. And that's a very good point. That college is not for every. There are other ways to learn. There are other ways to get an education. Personally, I think we will see an education revolution in the next 10 to 20 years. I really do. I think the cost is unsustainable, and I think that online education is going to slowly replace university education. It might be run through universities, but it'll be at a fraction of the cost. And I think that's coming. Yeah.
I think it's only recent years that the Orthodox Church has had education for children. Years ago, they didn't have Sunday school, and the kids were just taught, you do what the priest tells you to do, follow, and this is the way it is. And now we're getting from society, they're telling us things that sound better. I don't know exactly how to express myself, but they're drawing the children away from the church because they're getting their answers somewhere else.
Yeah, let me repeat the question. So the remark was that in the Orthodox Church, we haven't had Sunday school education for all that many years. And it's, it's one day a week, for whatever it is, 60 minutes or so, and it seems that our children are getting answers to their questions other places than the church, I believe is what you're saying. Yes, this is a problem. And I have to say, the solution starts here. It starts with me, with you, with you, with you, with you. The adults, we have to engage with these ideas, because if we don't, you know who's going to engage with the young people? The other guys. The other guys, the propagandizers, the guys who are going to reach into the boat and pull them overboard. That's who's going to engage with them. We can't wait for our kids to come and young people to come, the altar servers to come and ask questions. We have to bring the questions to them. This has to be up front. We have to educate ourselves, and we have to use the language, we have to bring the fight to them. We can't sit back and be passive any longer, or else we're done. We are losing this battle, and we will lose, because they're fighting and we're not. We need to educate ourselves and do right by the younger generation. We do.